Thanks for coming to the 2015 Ethics, Politics, and Economics Meet the Author Talk. Great turnout this year, and we really appreciate you guys all showing up. So this is going to be an economics lecture, and I guess it makes sense to start by talking about trade-offs, specifically the trade-off that you've all made in being here right now instead of outside where it's 75 degrees and sunny. Professor Eastley has the misfortune to have shown up on the nicest day of the year to give a lecture in a basement. So I think it's an interesting decision that you've all made this trade-off to be here right now instead of outside, because I'm sure that a non-zero percentage of people in this room have also made the decision to hit the snooze button instead of going to micro in the morning. So if we put on our economist caps, we can ask ourselves, why is that? Why have some people in this room chosen to come to this economics lecture on this beautiful day, despite having dozed through economics lectures in the past? And I think the answer is Bill Easterly, and it's my pleasure to welcome him to Yale this afternoon. A researcher at the World Bank from 1985 to 2001, Professor Easterly has since taken up residence at NYU, where he teaches economics and is the head of NYU's award-winning Development Research Institute. The author of 3 books, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and according to his website, the 11th most famous native of Bowling Green, Ohio, Professor Easterly is a prominent critic of the standard approach to foreign aid, and in his work at NYU, he has taken the lead in developing an alternative paradigm for international development. He has been featured on CNN and the BBC, and in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, just to name a few. Professor Easterly's talk today shares part of its title with his most recent work, 2013's The Tyranny of Experts, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor. And it was after reading that book that we decided to ask Professor Easterly to come and give a lecture. We being the EP&E department's Meet the Author Committee, made up of myself and 4 other students who are here today, who were tasked with reading a series of books over the summer and then choosing one of the authors to invite to come and give a talk at Yale. So we reconvened in the fall, having read the books, and I actually have to say it was a very easy choice. The Tyranny of Experts combines historical and contemporary evidence with economic analysis to suggest that a top-down approach to aid in the developing world might in fact be strengthening authoritarian rulers at the expense of those that the international community is trying to help. I won't say much more about it, I'll leave that to the author, but I do want to talk about what made the book really stand out to us on the committee. So EP&E, the name of the department hosting this talk, stands for Ethics, Politics, and Economics, 3 things that academia generally keeps in separate compartments. But Professor Easterly's book combines them all, which made it a natural choice for us. Of course, there's plenty of economics. It's a book about international development, and Professor Easterly offers compelling arguments about why some nations haven't developed economically and what can be done to change that. But part of that economic argument is about politics. Professor Easterly writes that well-intentioned foreign aid becomes counterproductive when it strengthens dictators and autocrats, who in turn undermine not just the economic, but the political rights of the world's poor. And finally, at the heart of the book is a moral claim, that those in the economic development community need to change their ways if they don't want to be complicit in oppression. Professor Easterly blends these 3 ostensibly separate disciplines with ease for one simple reason. His book is about the real world, where ethics, politics, and economics are inextricably intertwined. Which brings us back to the question I posed earlier. Why have some people in this room chosen to come to this economics lecture despite having skipped other economics lectures in the past? Undergraduates in their first econ class often end up wondering what all the talk about utility curves and 2-person exchange economies has to do with the real world, and it's when those questions go unanswered that the snooze button starts looking like a utility maximizing option. But you don't have to wonder about the real-world relevance of Professor Easterly's work, and I think that's why we're all so excited to hear him speak. So, without further ado, Bill Easterly.
Thank you, David, for that very warm introduction. Really appreciate it. It's really a pleasure to be here. Let me do a sound check, first of all. Some of you might be surprised that I'm a lot more mild-mannered in person than I seem to be in the writings. So my voice doesn't carry that well. Can you hear me in the back? Raise your hand if you cannot hear me. So this is the real way you test hypotheses in economics. Only if you cannot hear me, raise your hand. Okay. I still don't believe you. Does this thing help? Is this actually amplifying anything? No. Okay. This is not amplifying anything. Right. Okay. All right. Are you guys good? Try again. Anyone who cannot hear me talking right now asking you this question. Actually, that's kind of a metaphysical thing. If you couldn't hear me, then you wouldn't be able to answer. Well, never mind. So let me jump right in. The claim in this book and in this talk is going to be that the mainstream approach to development can often lead to an unintentional tyranny of experts that neglects the rights of poor people. Now, how exactly could that happen? So let me just start out straight away with what we think of very often when we think about doing development. We think of a series of technical problems that cause the poor to be poor, that cause the poor to suffer ill health, poor education, low income. And we think of technical solutions that would really alleviate a lot of those problems directly. So, for example, we might think of and what's nice about these technical solutions and the reason they're so popular in development debates is because they're so tangible and so clear how they lead to a solution. So you might think of, say, malnutrition. Part of malnutrition is vitamin deficiency. There's some very simple, inexpensive remedies like vitamin A capsules that remedy vitamin A deficiency, that improve the problem of malnutrition. It's extremely straightforward and appealing that you could just solve that dimension with something so simple and direct and inexpensive. Malaria. Malaria is carried by mosquitoes, as I hope all of you know. And you want to kill the mosquitoes. One of the best ways to do that, people have found, is you spray the walls of indoor walls of people's houses where they're going to be sleeping when they're most at risk from being bitten by mosquitoes with a chemical called pyrethrum that when the mosquitoes land on the wall, that kills them. Then they can't transmit malaria. It's, you assemble enough technical solutions like this, and it sounds like you're starting to have some very convincing answers for the problems of poverty. Or to take another example, maybe some piece of land is not very fertile for growing food crops. It'd be a lot more fertile for growing a forest that you could sell forest products. Then you just need technical forestry advice. This last example is actually relevant because now I'm going to give you an example that shows some of the shortcomings of this purely technical approach to development, which often claims to be apolitical. It claims to be ethically neutral, speaking of ethics, morally neutral. So let's take an example about what some of the limitations of that approach might be. So I'm going to tell you a story that begins on the morning of February 28, 2010, a little over more than 5 years ago. Some villagers in Mubende district, Uganda, woke up to the sound of gunfire. Some of them woke up, some of them were in church. When they heard the sound of gunfire, they came running out of their homes and out of the church. And soldiers with guns were, please make yourself comfortable. You are very welcome. I don't take it personally that you're late. Sorry. So back to the story. Sorry, I'm just teasing you. You're fine. The villagers of Mubende district. Why were there men with guns in Mubende district, Uganda? Men were shooting their cattle. They were driving people at gunpoint from their homes, and then they started to burn down the homes. And they torched the crops and kept people at gunpoint away from rescuing their homes and crops. And why were they doing this? This was a World Bank forestry project. The World Bank had financed a private company that together decided they needed the land for a forestry project. And the way they implemented this project was to march families who had been on this land for generations off their land at gunpoint and start their forestry project. Now, there's one thing that's unusual about this story, and unlike many other similar rights violations that happen so it's fairly obvious right away what the problem is here, right? That you thought you had an apolitical, ethically neutral technical solution, but you actually grossly violated the rights, the basic human rights and land rights of poor people. And to give you an indication of how the development community as a whole, the whole business of doing development is not really that sensitive to these issues. Let me tell you about what happened next. So there's one really unusual thing that happened next is that Oxfam heard about this and they publicized it in a report which in turn got the attention of the New York Times. And this whole story actually appeared on the front page of the New York Times, and actually in September of 2011. But then, so you would have thought if anyone was ever going to be held accountable for a rights violation in development, this would be the time. You're on the front page of the New York Times. The World Bank is directly accused by the New York Times of financing rights violations. And I was writing a blog called Aid Watch while this was going on and really monitoring this in real time. And what I noticed next were two non-events. The World Bank, actually, the day this story came out, they said, oh, we will investigate. But then, someone's calling me. It might be the World Bank. No. Yeah, they're investigator. The World Bank promised that day on Twitter that they would do an investigation. That investigation has never happened. They never did an investigation. They never considered in what way they might have been responsible for this tragic event that happened. The second non-event was that nobody in development really protested this. The World Bank really did get away with this because the World Bank never did an investigation into their own actions that would have identified what they did wrong to make this tragic event happen, and then nobody really protested in development. So they've never really had to face the consequences of what happened originally happened on February 28, 2010, now more than 5 years ago. So why is that? It's because there are so many people in development that are focused on these technocratic, what we could call technocratic approach to development. Technocrat is a combination of technical and autocrat, that you think you have a technical solution, but the people who are actually implementing the technical solutions are authoritarian actors. They're actors that don't face any democratic accountability to the people that they are affecting, whose rights they are violating. So the people involved in this story are the autocratic government of Uganda and the autocratic actor of the World Bank that has no mechanism for democratic accountability to the people whose projects, the people that the World Bank is directly affecting with its own projects. So that's the problem in this whole story, is that there is no accountability. Now, let's start talking about rights. First of all, and this has been the point so far, is that rights are obviously a moral end in and of themselves. That poor people have rights to their own land, that they should not be coerced at gunpoint to give up their own lands and be forced to move somewhere else they don't want to go. That's a moral violation in and of itself, and we should care about that. And that really is, by itself, enough of a reason to talk a lot about human rights, political rights, economic rights in development. And actually, I wish all of us would be satisfied with that we wouldn't ask anything else that rights do, and that we would still want rights just in and of themselves, because we want our rights respected. We think everyone else's rights should be respected also. That's a moral cause. Now, I do have to say, as an economist, we're not usually talking in this way that I'm talking right now. We're not usually talking about moral issues like violating poor people's rights. And so one instinct, it's a little bit of an advantage that you guys are from a program that has the word ethics in it. That's better than my usual audience of economic students. So I usually feel I have to apologize as an economist for talking about these seemingly sentimental, moral, emotional issues like rights. It's like I'm confessing I cry at the end of Hollywood romantic comedies or something. It's, it's a really embarrassing kind of position for an economist to be in. But I want to argue that it's actually quite a natural position for an economist to be in for a couple of reasons. First of all these boring classes that David does not want to go to, that he wants to sleep through, what are the models actually based on? They're based on individuals making their own choices, acting in their own interests. Making their own choices, acting in their own interests. Individuals who are free to choose, who are not coerced to do something they don't want to do. So all of our basic models in economics are presuming a basic rights infrastructure, that people's rights are respected. And so if an economist is suddenly transported to some place where that is not true, then it's incumbent on the economist to point it out. That, hey, our usual assumptions don't apply here because you're dealing with someone violating someone else's rights, not letting them be free to choose, coercing them. There's a more wonky way to put this, which is economists have this principle called revealed preference, which, as usual in economics, is a really boring, confusing terminology for a really simple concept. It's simply that people reveal by their choices what they want. That's all that it means. It's called revealed preference. So we need that principle to be sure that we're actually making people better off, that people are free to choose. We need that to be in place to be sure that we're actually making people better off. So in this example, if we had been sure that the Mubende farmers had been free to choose and had voluntarily consented to selling their land to a forestry company or to the World Bank, that would have been fine. Then we could infer that they were better off because they had voluntarily decided to sell their land, to give up their land for a price to the forestry company and the World Bank. That's what we call revealed preference. We need that to be sure they're better off. If people are coerced to do something, then actually we're pretty sure they're probably worse off, because coercion would not be necessary unless it was something that they felt would make them worse off. That's when coercion is necessary. So economists do have a language and do have at the center of our models these concerns with rights. And then finally, and not most importantly, but it is important, we do, of course, also want to know whether rights are actually good for producing the other thing we care about, which is material development, which is relief from material poverty. And here I don't have time to kind of sketch out any kind of elaborate body of theory and evidence, but I'll just sort of take it as fairly obvious, and those of you who have taken economics classes will know that this is pretty much the consensus in economics, that yes, a society in which people are free to make their own economic choices and political choices is one that is likely to solve their problems better than a society that is coercing people against their will. And why is that? Well, in the market, we know how easily that works. If people are free to buy whatever they want from whomever they want, and the suppliers are free to compete and enter and compete with each other to meet the needs of consumers, we're pretty sure that's a system that's going to result in making people's needs get met. So that's kind of our first basic layer of Econ 101, that we think this system of rights that people are free to choose actually results in successful problem solving, a very successful problem solving system. And the same sort of principles sort of hold in politics, not quite as clearly, and we don't model them quite as simply as we do in the markets, but the same principles hold in politics. If people are free to choose their governments and free to choose between different political parties and actors that are competing to be in the government, and people have their own rights protected against the government doing harm to them and can protest vociferously if the government does do any harm to them, well, then that's a situation where the government is not likely to do as much harm to them when people are free to protest and free to vote that abusive government out of power. That's a situation where people are more likely to not have their rights violated, to not have their problems trampled upon. And more positively, when they're choosing between political entrepreneurs who are competing to solve their public goods needs, supplying higher quality health services and education services and roads. This doesn't work perfectly, but it does work that when there's competition to supply these public needs, that the voters and the political protesters will reward the politicians that supply the public goods, and they will penalize the politicians that don't supply the public goods. I mean, a few states over here, we have a New Jersey governor who just caused one little traffic jam on a bridge, and it destroyed his whole presidential campaign, thank God. Sorry, the last part is off the record. It's to even put this in more explicit terms, take the Mubende story, and suppose you had transposed that to, I think of it transposing it to my home state, home part of a state, Northwest Ohio, which is farm country. Do you think if the World Bank and an autocratic Ohio government had gone in with guns blazing and driven farmers off their land in Ohio, that they would have gotten away with no investigation, with no consequences, that nobody would have protested? Do you really think that would have happened? No. This is the sort of, we forget about the biggest virtue of democracy is often what does not happen in democracy. There's lots and lots of bad things that do not happen in democracy because we have the right to protest and the right to vote abusive and bad rulers out of power. Now, I'm very far from arguing that it's a perfect utopian, wonderful solution, all problems are instantly solved. Of course not. You know, we have a Congress whose approval rating is no longer detectable by modern methods. We have a terrible-looking presidential campaign. There's lots of bad stuff that happens in democracy. But there's this basic currency of protest and mobilization and voting that you can be sure that any politician who is going to do horrible things to the voters or totally fail to deliver the most basic public services is going to pay a political price. That is the basic 101 of democracy that is like the market 101 of private suppliers meeting needs. So that's the kind of basic approach to development that surprisingly is neglected in this whole technical approach to development. We neglect the whole atmosphere of rights that is necessary to make problems get solved, both public problems and private problems. So let me give you some more examples of how popular this technocratic approach is. Bill Gates is a good example of someone who seems very much in love with the technocratic approach. And let me take you to another country where Bill Gates is operating a lot, Ethiopia. Bill Gates wrote an article in which he praised the Ethiopian government for setting clear goals, choosing an approach, measuring results, and then using these measurements to continually refine our approach. Our, I guess, meant him and the Ethiopian government working together. The Ethiopian government at that time was actually a not very lovely autocrat named Meles Zenawi, who himself had a long string of human rights violations and another involuntary resettlement story that I'm going to tell you in a moment. So this is the essence of the technocratic solution. The technical experts work with the autocrat to implement the technical solutions, not realizing that neglecting the atmosphere of rights that needs to exist for these problems really to be lastingly solved. Gates doesn't quite get this. This sentence that I just quoted you, clear goals, measuring results, using measurements to continually refine our approach, experts and autocrats alliance approach. This helps us deliver, this is another quote from Gates, this helps us deliver tools and services to everybody who will benefit. Us, again, who does he mean by us? The Gates Foundation and the Ethiopian autocrat working together, to everybody who will benefit. That's a very strong claim for a list of technical solutions that's operating in a right where actually the Ethiopian government is also pursuing involuntary resettlement schemes. There's an exact parallel to the Uganda story that I could tell you about the Gambela region of Ethiopia, where projects financed by the British Aid Agency and the World Bank and USAID are also resettling farmers at gunpoint and moving them to Ethiopian government-sponsored so-called model villages that are anything but model villages. So all of these abuses are also going on in this second wave of examples. And yet Bill Gates is under the illusion that this technocratic approach, measuring results, clear goals, we deliver tools and services to everybody who will benefit. So I have to confess, Bill Gates sort of became the perfect technocrat example for me to use as kind of someone punching bags, sorry. Sort of like he's my new kind of Jeff Sachs. He's so technocratic, he might embarrass other technocrats. But and then, unfortunately, Meles, who was one of my favorite examples, died of natural causes in late 2012. But then Gates praised his equally autocratic successor, Haile Mariam, for his thoughtfulness and knowledge, as well as his commitment to continuing the policies of Prime Minister Zenawi. Now, let me, at this point, try to bend backwards as far as possible to be fair to the other side. Maybe Gates is really only thinking about maybe he really is only thinking about what we could call aid instead of development. That there are a few technical problems that Gates could actually make better with his foundation, with some technical solutions. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. If he's making poor people's lives better directly with his foundation, with these technical solutions, that's okay. But it's not development. It's maybe, humanitarian aid. It's alleviation of short-term alleviation of suffering. Short-term alleviation of suffering is great. I'm all for that. But it's not development. And so what creates the unintentional tyranny of experts is that, first of all, Gates does not realize the difference between aid and development. That aid is like this tiny little mouse, and development is this huge elephant, which is mainly homegrown efforts of people around the world for their own development. And he's confusing the two. And second of all, Gates himself becomes then a major player in the debates on rights and development, democracy and development, dictatorship and development. Because Gates is a very important player in aid, he becomes a very important participant in development debates. So let's be as kind as possible to Gates. Maybe he thinks he has to say nice things about the Ethiopian government to do his technical solutions in Ethiopia. Maybe he has to play nice with the government, and there is that dilemma. And so he basically has to censor himself to be able to operate in Ethiopia, and that might be okay, except for the fact that he's also this big player in the big debate on democracy, autocracy, and poor people's rights. Oops. I just did something that could be really disastrous for your computer. Sorry. I just spilled water on your computer. No, do you have a do you have a paper towel? I do this every talk. It's great for kind of breaking up the
monotony. I was really getting bored of not having my computer.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. I got so excited about Gates. Sorry. Sorry about that, David. Send me the bill. Actually, send it to Gates. He can afford it. Wow. I'm really sorry. I think it really will dry out. Why don't you unplug it so you don't electrocute yourself? Turn it off and put it upside down. Okay. Yeah, we're not going to use. We're going to be without slides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Just put it upside down and let it dry out. We'll negotiate a technical solution to this later. Okay. Okay, well that was a little bit of a buzzkill, but let's try to get back on track here. Yeah. We'll work on it later. I've heard that water is actually not as disastrous as you think for PCs. We'll have to dry out.
Yep.
Okay. So let me try to bring your attention back to the big point, which is Gates is self-censoring himself to participate in an aid program in Ethiopia. That would be okay. But then he's also got this article on the front page of the Wall Street Journal weekend section where he's presenting his whole approach to development, and it's about enabling, justifying an autocratic regime that is violating the rights of Ethiopians, resettling them at gunpoint from their own lands and moving them to government villages that have no basic services. So the problem here is, it's really, to be fair to all the aid people, all the aid experts who did not intend to be tyrannical, who did not intend to neglect rights on their own. They may privately express, and Gates himself may privately express his desire that rights are a good thing, that democracy is a good cause. The problem is simply that the technical aid actors have to censor themselves, and then they in turn are the main participants in development debates. So we have a censored development debate. That's the unintentional tyranny of experts. If everyone in development, all the main actors in development are trying to provide aid through autocratic regimes, censoring themselves, they're not allowing themselves to criticize autocrats, to criticize rights violations. So we have a highly censored debate that never considers how autocrats may be both morally and pragmatically wrong for poor people. That's the unintentional tyranny of experts that we wind up with after the technocratic approach lives itself out. So the big question is really even stronger than that. It's that the aid regime and the regime that favors the technocratic approach is itself politically convenient in another way. And that is that the one thing going on here, it's not only that aid is going to Ethiopia and Uganda because technical actors are trying to do technical solutions. There's another thing going on here. The politics of aid is that Ethiopia and Uganda are both major allies of the U.S. in the war on terror. And so I think you're familiar with the history of aid to know that aid was used a lot during the Cold War to go to U.S. allies against the Soviets. This is happening again. I'm sure this won't surprise you in the war on terror, that development aid is going to allies of the U.S. in the war on terror. And so this idea of sort of technocratic political neutrality is awfully welcome to U.S. political actors who don't want to talk about rights violations of governments that they need on their side for the war on terror. And so basically this self-censored debate is self-censored in another way, that the development actors realize they can form kind of an alliance with the national security interests who just want to, and the national security interest is a legitimate interest. I'm not questioning the legitimacy of the U.S. need to defend itself against terrorists. But what's happening in this case is there are a lot of rights violations that are indirectly happening because of the U.S. war on terror and embracing autocratic allies. And with the way that the technocratic approach to development is awfully convenient for these guys is that it enables them to get a whole other body of political support for supporting autocratic regimes, which is the humanitarian aid community that is convinced that they can work with the autocrats to deliver the relief to poor people in these countries. And so we have a kind of alliance of humanitarians and national security interests. Politicians, it's another prediction of political economy, is that politicians always want to maximize the share of the votes they get. That's a very obvious prediction of political economy. So if you have two separate lobbies that you can gain with one set of ideas, that you want autocrats for the war on terror, and you have some idea of kind of benevolent developmental autocrats who are allegedly developing their own countries with the help of U.S. aid and World Bank aid, that set of ideas is very convenient for getting this nice alliance of sort of the national security interests who want the autocrats for the war on terror and the humanitarian interests who will overlook the autocratic regimes because they're under the illusion that there can be a technocratic solution to development, that you can just deliver the technical solutions without ever having to question the human rights violations of the autocrats that you're working with. So one way to put this, and so of course what is not possible under that set of ideas is to challenge the status quo. But this status quo is actually leading to a lot of rights violations of poor people that is actually bad for them in itself and bad for development. So another way to help illustrate the way that these technocratic ideas are politically useful are to sort of go back to their historical origins. This is something that I actually had a lot of fun researching and reading about in the research for this book, is to go back and to trace the historical origins of the idea of technocratic development. That development was just a long list of technical solutions, that you could ignore the political regime under which those technical solutions are happening. So the first time in history that that's happened was actually under colonial rule. So colonial rule is another set of autocrats, except in this case the autocrat is, say, for the British Empire, the British Colonial Office, the Secretary of State for the colonies, and they are the ones who really, in the 1930s and 40s in Africa and earlier in China in the 1920s and 1930s, and around the same time in Latin America, working with some unlovely Latin American autocrats, sort of pioneered this technocratic approach to development. The British colonial authorities were very happy about these technocratic ideas because they allowed them to sidestep the whole issue of ending colonial rule, of granting independence to the colonies, which is starting to become an issue in the 20th century, of course, although at that time in the 30s and 40s, the British expected the colonial empire to continue indefinitely. So there's lots of examples of very similar technocratic approaches that during the colonial period in the 1930s. One slide that I lost by pouring water over David's computer is a comparison of technocratic solutions in 1938 and today. So I've already played a little trick on you that I apologize for that you didn't realize. Remember when I said one technical solution was vitamin A capsules to malnutrition? That was mentioned in a 1938 colonial report called a massive 1,000-page colonial report, which if you don't behave properly during this lecture, I'm going to force you to read. A 1,000-page colonial report called An African Survey, led by a British colonial official named Lord Haley. So in 1938, he had already proposed vitamin A capsules for malnutrition. I also set you up to consider pyrethrum spraying on the walls of houses. That was also already in the 1938 survey, colonial survey written in 1938, which is when, during a period when colonial rule was expected to continue forever and ever. Or at least Lord Haley wanted it to continue forever and ever. He made statements like, political liberties are meaningless unless they can be built on a better foundation of social and economic progress. Social and economic progress meaning the technical solutions that the colonial authorities are offering there. And another British official said in 1943, we should not concentrate on the pursuit of political ideals. Very similar statements are made today. Why are you talking about political ideals when we have all these nice technical solutions to poor people's problems? So the colonial authorities said, don't talk about political ideals. That would be to the detriment of the preeminent need for improving the physical and social conditions. That's an exact quote from the British colonial report in 1943. So the idea, even already back then, was that we can justify colonial rule as the benevolent autocrat that is delivering material development. And one way to think about the technocratic idea is it's like a massive sort of distraction principle. It's like, don't look at the rights violations over here that we're imposing foreign colonial rule on hundreds of millions of people against their will. Look at the technical solutions over here that the colonial authorities are supplying to meet the needs of poor colonial subjects. And that's the same distraction principle that is going on today. Gates is saying, don't look at the human rights violations being directly financed by the way, the Ethiopian resettlement project is also directly being financed by the World Bank, USAID, and the British aid DFID. So it's the aid agencies and the U.S. foreign policy makers today are saying, don't look at these rights violations over here, look at the technical solutions over here, and that is derailing and sidetracking any debate that would question the status quo. That would question the status quo both either in colonial times or in Cold War times or war on terror times, in which there's an alliance of Western interests with humanitarian interests that both are all working together for something that sounds very good, technical solutions to poor people, but winds up sidetracking, derailing, and silencing the debate on rights for poor people that we should be having, that we should have been having back then in colonial times, and that we should be having now. And of course, back then in colonial times, we did eventually have that debate. But unfortunately, what happened after that was the Cold War, so that the new rulers of the independent states after the end of colonialism were often autocrats that were still supported by U.S. foreign policy and U.S. aid, with the same kind of alliance of humanitarian and national security interests during the Cold War, and then that leads up to what I already told you about today's status quo of the war on terror. So that's the sense in which the technocratic approach, it sounds good as a set of technical solutions to poor people's problems, but it profoundly does a big disservice to the cause of human rights, of political and economic freedom for poor people. It silences and sidetracks that debate that we should be having. And so that debate has never really happened. So let me give you one final sort of political example that again gives you a sense of why technocratic ideas are not quite the right solution for poor people. And this one I can put in the context of U.S. history, a group that was afflicted with a lot of rights violations and poverty in U.S. history, and that is the case of American blacks. and the discrimination and rights violations and poverty that they suffered. What's interesting is that around the same time that Lord Hailey and British colonial officials were writing about the technocratic justification for colonial rule, FDR during the New Deal and during World War II was trying to convince blacks that the solution to their needs were also technical solutions, that the U.S. government was offering technical material relief to poor black Southerners in the South. And was that enough to actually make change? No, something else happened to make change. It was the civil rights movement. So this was sort of started when, to give you an example, in 1940, Eleanor Roosevelt had lunch with the black leader Ralph Bunche, who was fighting for the end of segregation and for rights for black Americans, and suggested to him that racism was, quote, most effectively attacked on the economic front. So that's, right away, again, the technical material solutions. White New Dealers tried to convince blacks that they should, quote, concentrate on the attainable goal of economic progress and to postpone the challenge to segregation, to postpone the challenge to their violation of their rights. And that's the same sort of request that is being made to us today about rights violations. That we keep indefinitely, forever and ever, postponing the discussion of rights violations to some future happy day after all the technical solutions of poverty have been solved. And that technocratic dream is an illusion. And of course, what happened with American blacks is something very different happened. A set of black leaders came along that were not content with technocratic solutions, that did demand their rights. So Martin Luther King came along, and he did not come up with a set of what usually happens with technocratic solutions is we have, at the end of a discussion of solving material poverty, we have a long list of technical remedies. It's sort of like the plan mentality, the action plan mentality. What should we do to end poverty? We should give vitamin A capsules. We should do forestry projects. We should provide textbooks for education. We have a long list of technical solutions. We should spray pyrethrum on the walls of malaria houses. And this gives the illusion of tangibility to the technocratic approach. It seems to sound so appealing that we have an action plan to solve technical poverty in a technical way. But of course, the problem with action plans is they don't necessarily lead to action. The World Bank calls itself the Knowledge Bank, and it is full of action plans. It's overflowing with action plans. But there's one set of World Bank economists that did a study recently on how much the World Bank's own knowledge reports on revealing its action plans for the technocratic solutions to poverty, how much they're actually read or cited. They found that 1/3 of all World Bank reports have never been downloaded. They're available online. They took hundreds of man-hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce. They're available online, but no one has ever downloaded them. That's presuming that the download will actually lead to reading, but it's not even downloaded. And 87% of World Bank reports have never been cited. To have influence, you need to have someone else say, oh, the World Bank report said this, and that was the answer, and we're going to do action based on this World Bank recommendation. It's never been cited, so nobody's noticed it, even if it was downloaded. So let's contrast that with Martin Luther King. He did not get on the steps of the Washington Memorial and say, I have a plan. He said, I have a dream. So, people are very dismissive of this kind of sentimental, emotional appeal to the value of human rights, the moral value of human rights for poor people, the moral value of political and economic rights for poor people. And yet, what is it that people actually remember? They don't remember the World Bank reports, all the thousands of action plans from think tanks and aid agencies. They remember Martin Luther King, I have a dream, arguing not for material solutions, but arguing that black people would be free at last, free at last, free at last. That's what sticks. That's what is itself a powerful force for change. So another slide that I lost from the computer is actually very well represented by this slide. I was going to click and show you my action plan, which is this. this really is my action plan. My answer to the excess abundance of action plans is not to give you another action plan. That's I have no action plan. I have a blank slide. The problem of poverty is not a shortage of action plans. It's not a shortage of technical solutions. It's a shortage of rights. And so the intellectual and moral case advocating for rights for poor people, that has far more power to end poverty than a set of action plans. Let me find whatever I wrote on my last page here. Now, of course, the campaign for rights is itself not easy. There's going to be a lot of setbacks. It's going to be slower than you would like. Advocacy itself often fails. You have to be very patient for that. The people who are most patient are those whose rights themselves are being violated. So the main agents of change are the people poor people themselves whose rights are being violated. Those are the ones who care the most about their own rights. Those are historically the agents of change, just like American blacks in the South were the agents of change in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. What the rest of us can do is advocate and support them, and certainly here is a kind of action plan. We can, yes, protest when U.S. aid dollars go to autocrats that directly repress their own people. We can protest even more when our own agencies with their own projects violate the rights of poor people. We cannot let the World Bank get away with a project that was even on the front page of the New York Times, and yet they suffered no consequences for that. The moral universe of development has to change to make that no longer acceptable. And so that will enable us to be critics and protesters about an unacceptable status quo, an alliance of what used to be colonialism and violations of poor people's rights is today an alliance of U.S. foreign policy and violations of poor people's rights. We can step outside of the aid world and participate openly without censorship, without censoring ourselves in the global debate on autocracy versus democracy. We can look ourselves for the Martin Luther Kings that are emerging all over the world and support them and not support the oppressors that are keeping them in jail. So to give one example, there's a very courageous Ethiopian blogger and dissident named Eskinder Nega who was put in jail by Meles Zenawi in 2012 and is in jail for an 18-year sentence for doing nothing but peacefully advocating democracy in Ethiopia. And we are paying his jailers because our U.S. tax dollars go to projects that support the Ethiopian government, paying the salaries of the jailers of Eskinder Nega. We can instead not give intellectual legitimacy to the Ethiopian autocrats, not give intellectual legitimacy to allies of convenience in the war on terror, but advocate for poor people's rights. So we must indeed join the moral debate on freedom around the world that is happening in places from Hong Kong to Venezuela, to Turkey, to Hungary, to Ukraine, to Ethiopia, to Uganda. It's happening all over the world. It's very complex. The good guys and the bad guys are not always crystal clear. But what is crystal clear is that it's not acceptable that people are beheld by the oppressors without freedom, without rights. We must convince many more to care about rights for the poor. We must convince many more that all men and women, black and white, deserve really to be free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank you very much.